We will be hearing next from Brian Hamer, who is the former director of the Illinois Department of Revenue, and from Ralph Martiri, the executive director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. And Brian, you will be leading off this dynamic duo. Welcome, Brian Hamer.
Thank you, Michael. So I noticed from the written agenda as my phone is going off incredibly, we'll turn that off, that we happen to be in room 1040 of this building, so I'm feeling very comfortable. So as the revenue guy, I do want to say that it's not quite all about revenue. People in government have an obligation to think hard and work hard to make government efficient. One of those reasons is that there's more money available for the causes that we all care about. And I can report to you, at least based on my experience, 12 years in state government, that there was always a great deal of effort and attention given to being more efficient. Am I echoing here?
Not out here, just up there.
Oh, okay, good. It's the kind of work that you don't read about in the newspaper. It's slow going, it's in the trenches, but government, in my observation, has been becoming more efficient year after year. Just in my world, in the Revenue Department, the headcount declined by almost 25%, but I think that by the time I left, our department was far more effective at what we did than when we had the larger headcount. And that's a reflection of technology and hard thinking. But ultimately, I think what we're facing in Illinois, as Jerry and others have said, is primarily a revenue problem. And are my slides up here? So I'm going to talk just a little to the slides. Let me just say that Illinois, in my judgment, has had a flawed revenue system for decades. We just haven't known it because there has been a workaround. Year after year, decade after decade, administration after administration, the state of Illinois simply borrowed billions and billions of dollars from the pension funds. And the chickens have now come home to roost. We're not able to do that anymore, and we have to confront the reality that we do not have sufficient revenue to pay for the things that we care about and to comply with the laws that are on the books. So let's talk about these problems a little bit. So we're going to go to the next slide, or I'm going to go to the next slide. Do I go to the next slide? Here we go. So I'm going to speak to these four issues. And by the way, I think you all also have hard copies, which you can take home with you. So let's just take a quick moment here to look at where the tax revenues come from, because many of you probably don't spend a lot of time focusing on the state budget books. But you'll see that we're talking primarily about individual income taxes and sales taxes that fund Illinois government. And then we have a series of other taxes as well. So let me begin by talking about the individual income tax. Income taxes are the primary way that large industrial states, at least those that do not have a great deal of natural resources, fund their government. Illinois was very late to the income tax world. By the time it imposed its income tax in 1969, 39 states and the District of Columbia had already adopted an income tax. The 41 states that currently impose a broad individual income tax, Illinois is one of only 8 states that impose a flat rate tax. The other states all have graduated taxes. And as kind of a side note, something that I just learned very late in life is that during the Depression, the state of Illinois actually imposed a highly progressive income tax. Interestingly, the Illinois Supreme Court struck the tax down, concluding that the General Assembly did not have the authority under the 1870 Constitution. The court later changed its mind, reversed its opinion in 1969. But it's not only blue states around the country that have graduated tax systems, but many deeply red systems have graduated, red states have graduated tax systems as well. And just to give you a few examples, and I think you may be able to see some of this on the chart, at least when you take it home. States like Kansas, North Dakota, Alabama, and South Carolina, they all have progressive tax systems. All of the states surrounding Illinois have graduated income tax systems, except for the state of Indiana. In 2010, before we increased the individual income tax rate from 3% to 5%, Illinois' tax rate was lower than the rate of every other state with a flat rate in the country, and lower than the top tax rate of every state with a graduated system. As you know, our tax rate is now 3.75%. Only 2 income tax states in the country have a lower flat rate, and those are Indiana and Pennsylvania. But those 2 states actually authorize local units of government to impose income taxes in at least some cases. In Indiana, I think it's the case that every county except for Lake County in northwest Indiana has a local income tax, and in Pennsylvania, school districts across the state impose their own income tax as well. There's only 1 state with a graduated system currently that imposes a tax rate of less than 3.75%, and that's North Dakota. It's not just a matter of rates, but it's also interesting to look at per capita collections. So this map here is actually old. It shows 2011 data. It's the most recent map that I could find on the internet. But it shows, and this is when the state of Illinois was already ramping up its income tax in fiscal year 2011, that we ranked 26 in the country with respect to per capita collections. And of course, Illinois has a very high per capita income amongst the states. So in fact, this map reflects the fact that we rely to a much lesser extent than many states across the country on the income tax. So I think there are 2 implications of this. One is, as I said before, we do not have enough resources to support the services that the citizens of Illinois demand. And second, the fact that we have such a low income tax rate pushes up our reliance on other taxes in Illinois that typically are regressive or harm Illinois businesses. Just 2 famous examples. One, as you all know, as we all are aware, are property taxes, which are high in Illinois. Another example is sales tax, where we also have very high sales taxes, particularly when we look at the combination of the state and local rates. Cook County received a lot of attention recently when it raised its sales tax by 1%. But in fact, this was not an unusual thing. During the past 5 years alone, there are 33 other counties across the state that either imposed a new sales tax or increased their sales tax, and 150 municipalities across the state did the same thing. And I think that's a reflection of the fact that the state is not imposing enough tax on the income tax side and not sharing some of those revenues with the states, with local governments. Okay, moving on quickly here. Beyond our relatively inadequate reliance on the income tax, I think it's fair to say that the state of Illinois fails to modernize our tax system as the economy changes. And this is something that we've seen for many decades, for generations here in Illinois. And the best example is the sales tax. So Illinois imposed a sales tax back in 1933, and it has essentially not changed since then, notwithstanding the dramatic changes in our economy. So back in 1933, of course, our economy was primarily manufacturing. It was all about things. It was not so much about services. Today, we live in a primarily services economy, and the way we do business and we live has changed dramatically. There are many facts and figures that one could articulate to show how there's become this disconnect between the tax system and our economy. One fact that I like to use is the following, and that is just between 2002 and 2012, personal consumption expenditures in Illinois increased by 40%, but sales tax revenue increased by only 16%, reflecting the state's failure to grow with the economy and keep up with government expenses. Now, in recent decades, I can think of only 2 changes to the sales tax, notwithstanding all the changes in our economy. One is the extension of the sales tax to photo processing. You know, how ironic. We don't do photo processing anymore. And the second is the extension of the sales tax to canned software, pre-written software. But unfortunately, very shortly after the General Assembly changed the law here, the Illinois Department of Revenue, before my time there, issued a regulation which dramatically restricted the scope of that change to the law. The state does not tax digital goods. I mean, think about this. So one day we were purchasing books on paper, and the sales tax applied. So now the world's changing, and many Illinois residents, not Brian Hamer, now buy digital books. Well, digital books are not subject to the sales tax. What kind of policy is that? And you can imagine the impact on our revenue and our budget. We used to rent DVDs. Now we have video streaming. Before there was tax, now there isn't. We used to download music. Now we used to purchase CDs. Now we download music. Same story. So the reality is that there's this disconnect between the sales tax and the world in which we now live. Now, I'm more skeptical than many that there's a lot of revenue here. There's certainly hundreds of millions of dollars, and I have 1 minute left, and there's so much more to say. But shouldn't we be thinking about ways to modernize our tax base? So let me just focus very quickly on 2 other points. One is the fact that Illinois has been unwilling, to a great extent, to question tax breaks. And there are all kinds of examples here. There's on the corporate side, our corporate income tax has many tax breaks. Often they don't even benefit Illinois businesses. They may benefit businesses that are located in other states but pay Illinois taxes. There's some very large expenditures on the individual income tax side. The most significant one, perhaps, is the exclusion for retirement income. Illinois has the most generous exclusion for retirement income in the country. It now costs the state about $2 billion a year. Of course, the senior population is growing dramatically, and that tax expenditure is only going to grow. I mean, interestingly, the exclusion applies to people that are under 65 years old, people that are very wealthy. And I think we have to ask the question in the context of budget crisis, whether these and other tax expenditures need to be reconsidered. Finally, just one quick point about the regressive nature of our tax system. I think this is one reason why it's so difficult to raise taxes in this state, because when you have a regressive tax system, it's hard to ask lower income and middle income people to pay more taxes. And I think this comes to William's point, really, and that is why the progressive community needs to think about whether working towards a progressive tax system, progressive income tax, should be priority number one. Because until the tax system is made more progressive and the burden is shifted to those who are best able to afford additional taxes, particularly in an era where more and more income is migrating to the upper tiers, we're going to find it very difficult to raise taxes to pay for the obligations that we have. Oh, there's so much more to talk about, Michael. You know, how can one possibly do the entire tax code in 10 minutes? But whatever I've missed, Ralph is going to address. So, Ralph, it's all yours.
All right, well, good morning. How are you? Good morning. So I'm going to try to put this whole thing in context, because we don't just work on the tax policy side of the ledger, we work on the budget and spending side of the ledger, and we work on it in a slightly different way. So hopefully I will be able to offend everyone in this room at some point, or I'm not doing my job. The bottom line is you have to look at your revenue system in context of your state's demography, its demands for core services, et cetera. Now, I'm all for the mantra that a state ought to live within its means. We've all heard that today, right? Living within our means. But that's only if our means support life. And in Illinois, the case is very clear that our means do not support life. They do not support funding the services that are necessary to just satisfy the demographically driven needs we have in our state. And if that's your fundamental problem, then yes, it's about the revenue, and yes, it's about tax policy, and find a way to enhance your revenue system. And I have some suggestions for doing that in a second. Efficiency. We all love efficiency. Everybody loves efficiency, right? Who's against efficiency? Anybody against it? Yeah, well, I'll leave now. The thing about efficiency, though, is it's very different if you want to be honest about what it is to be efficient in the public sector. Education isn't more efficient at educating young children with less teachers and greater class size, particularly K through 3. You are more efficient in attaining your outcome of educating these children with smaller class sizes and more teachers. Social workers, are you more efficient meeting the needs of your clients if your caseload goes up immeasurably? No, you are not. So we have to understand that public services are labor-intensive services. And to more efficiently meet the goals that we have of satisfying, again, our demographically driven demand, we have to have adequate revenue to have the people on the street providing the service, period, end of story. That's efficient. All right, now for our actual state budget. Well, the last time we actually had one was 2015. This breaks that budget down into big categories. You'll see a top and bottom half here. The top half is something we call hard costs. These are things the state has to pay without a vote. So we had about a $35 billion budget in 2015. And as you can see from this, roughly $11 billion of that was spent on debt service, pension contributions, and something called statutory transfers out. The two biggest of those, by the way, accounting for over 98%, the local government distributive fund, where the state shares its income tax revenue with local governments, and some Medicaid transfers required under trust agreements we have with the feds. No vote has to be expended. Then you get to the $24 billion part of the budget that has some discretion in it. Where does that money get spent? 9 out of $10 go to 4 things: education, healthcare, social services, and public safety. Show me the poor priority there. Which one of those things indicates that Springfield doesn't understand where it should be investing our taxpayer money? Or does Springfield have it pretty much right? Those are the 4 core services we demand. Group health. That's just a health insurance policy the state keeps on its workers. And interestingly enough, we've never actually budgeted the full liability for group health. It's always more than what we put in the budget book, so we could appear as if we are closer to a balanced budget when in fact we're not. And then there's everything else, 4% of the budget. Economic development, environmental protection, housing, all that stuff is down there in that bottom 4%. Oh, state administrative costs. Now, If you're looking for the line item for waste, fraud, and abuse, and Senator Trotter, really, let's just put that in the budget and be done with it. Here's what we're going to waste, fraud, and abuse, right, and go on. While there is no line item for waste, fraud, and abuse, what I can tell you now is it's not a material problem in the state of Illinois. We are a highly efficient state. To Brian Hamer's point, we have been cutting expenditures. We have been disinvesting in state staff. We are about as if, in fact, we're inefficient because we have too few staff. That's how deep and meaningful the cuts have been over time. So I wanted to show you that cutting spending on services is no prescription for getting us out of our fiscal difficulties. This would be the governor's proposal for 2016, the year that started in July and still doesn't have a budget. Go to the little top corner over there, Roman numeral 1, 2016 projected revenue, $31.6 billion. Then here's those hard costs that they have to pay by law, no discretion. It's $11 billion coming up for 2016, leaving a net of $20.2 billion in revenue. Next line, start with your $20.2 billion in revenue. We have $5.9 billion in unpaid bills left over from 2015 that by law have to be paid from 2016 revenue in 2016 as a priority. By the way, just to brag about CTBA and our numbers analysis for a second, we came up with that $5.9 billion projection in February of last year. Moody's and Standard & Poor's acknowledged it was $5.9 billion about a month ago. It took them a little while to figure out what we had figured out in advance, but we're offering our help to Moody's as it stands now. So once you pay that $5.9 billion in past due bills, that only leaves $14 billion in current revenue for current services. Take that down to line 3, $14 billion in revenue. The governor proposes to spend $20 billion on services this year, which means the deficit grows from 5.9 to 8.4 billion, despite the fact that year to year the governor proposes cutting spending by 1.8 billion. We cut spending by 1.8 billion and watch our deficit grow by 3 billion. It's a revenue problem. Now, that kind of understates how much our accumulated deficit's growing because of that little problem with actually budgeting the full amount of group health liability. So in the governor's budget, he misses about $770 million of group health liability we know the state's going to incur, meaning the deficit will jump to over $9 billion. If you look at what he proposes to spend on education, health, social services, and public safety, 40% of that spending will be deficit spending in 2016. Show of hands, who thinks that's a sustainable thing? 40% deficit spending. That big ramp up in expenditures on services never happened in the great state of Illinois. This is looking at our actual budgeted expenditures for core services 2009 through 2015. No adjustment for inflation, just what was actually put in the budget to spend. You see a ramp up? No, there's a little blip between 2013 and 2014, some increased expenditures in that year, right? All accounted for by two things. Health and medicine people, you know one of them, right? When the Fed said no to a bunch of cuts we tried to do to Medicaid under the SMART Act, we had to put those services back in. The other part of that growth in spending was a little increase in the budgeted amount, again, for group health, getting closer to the actual liability, but still understating it. There is no increase in spending on services, and this is the period of time during our temporary tax increase. So we have new revenue coming in, but we're not spending it on services. We are cutting expenditures on current services. Now, why would that be? The growth in our hard costs. And Brian Hamer, I thought, hit this very well. See, for decades, the state has not had adequate revenue to fund its four core services of education, health, social services, and public safety. Just hasn't. The way it papered over this structural imbalance was by borrowing, as Brian said, against its pension system, and then deferring the repayment of this borrowing until, now. This chart shows that pretty well. If you look at the three different parts of the bar, these are our hard costs, the non-discretionary expenditures in the general fund budget. The little blue bar at the bottom, that's debt service owed to outside third parties, financial institutions, bondholders, that kind of thing. You see, we didn't even have any of such debt service in the general fund until the middle of the sequence. The orangey, weird colored bar in the middle, that's the statutory transfers out. It's primarily sharing income tax revenue with local governments and Medicaid transfers. Notice, after inflation, that really hasn't grown. Then there's the gray bar at the top. This is our pension payment. Yeah, that's grown from, what, 1.4 billion to 6.8, and actually that 6.8 is a little stale. It's now projected to be about 7.2 billion for 2016. All of that growth in the pension payment is debt service. Not an ounce of it is to cover the normal cost of providing benefits to current workers. In fact, the normal cost of funding those benefits over this entire sequence varied from 1.2 to 1.6 billion, predicated on actuarial assumptions, et cetera. It didn't change. It stayed steady. What grew was this backloaded repayment of the debt to the pension system. That's a creature of statute that became law in 1995. That was done so they wouldn't have to deal with increasing taxes then. No one thought this ramp could be paid. I'm pretty good at tax policy. I teach a master's course on it. I've lectured the Fulbright Scholar Program on it. I can't design a tax system that jumps like this from year to year and still fund services. If we want to fund the current payment plan for our pensions passed as a boondoggle in 1995, we have to cut spending collectively on education, health, social services, and public safety by 46% over the next 30 years. Good idea? Show of hands? No. We need more revenue in the system. All right, I just closed this little thing and open it again. Here's our problem. The state has an honest structural deficit. That just means when you solely adjust for inflation and population changes, you assume a normal economy, your revenue growth will not keep up with the cost of providing the same level of services. I just pulled out a report done on the state's structural deficit from 1996 by Professors Gertz, Nolan, and McGuire. 1996. If you look at this graph, it's scary. It assumes you start with a balanced budget in 2015. The state had an accumulated deficit of $5.9 billion that year. The green bar is the cost of the current services being provided, adjusted solely for historic rates of inflation and population changes, assuming a normal economy, and our current debt service, no adjustment. So the pension ramp, all other debt services is in there. The red bar is our current law and tax policy, adjusted for inflation and population changes and assuming a normal economy. The gap is the growth in the structural imbalance between our revenue system and the cost of the services we provided and the debt we've incurred. Our deficit's gonna grow. You really want to cut spending to solve that problem? It'd be disastrous. It'd be disastrous for people. It wouldn't work anyway. So here's how you solve the problem. Number one, and even the Supreme Court of the state of Illinois, by the way, in its decision on pension law, cited our work and said this was a good idea, so maybe it ought to become law. Re-amortize the pension debt. Flatten it out. Flatten that repayment out to be a level dollar amount. Look at the difference. The current law is the red bar. Those are three different scenarios to get the state anywhere between 75 and 80% funded over the next 30 years on a level dollar. Look how much you save. All that savings goes to current services. We cannot solve our fiscal problems, even with tax reform, without re-amortizing our pension debt. And by the way, you know what it takes to do that? A change in law, because we owe this to ourselves. There's no bank that has to sign off on this. This is debt the state owns to its own system. It was established pursuant to a statute passed in 1995. We just need to redo it. That's number one. All right, number two, our sales tax. Brian suggested that maybe we're not taxing enough of the economy. 45 states in the nation have a sales tax. Of those 45, we have the most narrow base. We tax less of the economy than any other state that has a sales tax. Why? Our sales tax pretty much only applies to goods not services. The blue bar is the percentage of the Illinois economy that is comprised of service transactions. It's now 72.5% of our economy. That's what we don't tax. The red bar is the percentage of our economy comprised of the sale of goods. It's now only 17%. That's what we do tax. Do you need a lot more for why that dog won't hunt? You just can't leave the largest and fastest growing segment of your economy out of your tax base and expect to have adequate recurring revenue to invest in core services. Won't happen. Now, is it slightly regressive to expand the sales tax base to services? Yes, it would be slightly regressive. That's true. Do we need more progressive taxation in Illinois? Absolutely. It's core to our mission. Now I'm going to offend everyone because, I do tax policy. It's just what I do. If you have a choice as an advocate between spending cuts on services and a regressive tax, and you really care about the economic condition of low-income families, pick the regressive tax every single time. Why do I say that? Maybe it'll cost the family another $100 a year, which is not insignificant. That's literally food off the table. We all know that here. What's the loss of child care services cost? What's the cost to a family of senior citizens that has an adult with developmental disabilities living with them that can't get services from the state? So their adult child gets violent and they get beaten. What's the cost to them? What's the cost to the children growing up in communities that cannot give them an adequate education? So yeah, we should fight for a progressive tax. We will lead the fight for a progressive tax. But in the interim, let's generate adequate revenue to fund our core needs. And let's build whatever fairness we can into the system through refundable credits and those kinds of things like the earned income tax credit, et cetera. All right. Income tax. Our rate of 3.75% is not enough. We got to bump it up. If you just bumped it up by a point, we would generate about $3.3 billion in net new revenue, $3.3 billion. Our magic number that we need to get to solve all the state's problems is somewhere between $7 and $8 billion. Sounds like a lot of money, right? $7 and $8 billion. We have a $745 billion economy. It's 1%. It's such a small tax increase in context of the Illinois economy, it cannot be measured by any peer-reviewed econometric model at the academic level. It is too small. So don't get scared by these numbers. The scary part of these numbers is we don't have the revenue to meet our demographically driven need. Taxing retirement income. Again, of the 41 states with an income tax, only 5 broadly exempt all retirement income. We got to tax some of it. But we are unfair. Let's not hurt fixed income seniors. So if you continue to allow the full deduction for families with $50,000 a year or less in AGI, you're not hitting one low-income senior. And you phase out that deduction over time so that no one pays the state's relatively low income tax rate on all of their retirement income until they have $150,000 a year in income or more, that generates $1 billion. Sales tax base expansion, $2 billion. And I guess the final thing I'm just going to say, and then I'm going to run off here and take questions, raising taxes won't harm our economy. The first thing I'm going to tell you about that is there's not one peer-reviewed study that shows a statistically meaningful correlation between a state's taxes and its economic growth. Other things matter more. Here is a really good argument for why you should just design your taxes to work and generate the revenue you need. This is a comparison of the 9 states in America that have no income tax at all. Those are the red states here, the miracle states of Texas and North Dakota, Florida. The blue bar are the 9 states in America that not only have an income tax, but they have the highest income tax rates, special rates for millionaires, highest effective overall rates. How do they compare against each other economically over the last decade? Let's see. Average unemployment rate, 6.1% per year in the high tax states, 6% per year in the no tax states. That would be a statistical tie, no difference. How about change in median income? Well, everybody's income went down. We had the Great Recession. The decline was 4.2% in the high tax states, 5% in the no tax states. Again, pretty much a statistical tie. How about growth in the state economy per capita? Here, actually, the high tax states have a statistically meaningful advantage over the no tax states. Now, there's probably a lot of complex data points here. This isn't a case that you tax yourself to prosperity. What is probably going on in those states is they're not cutting current expenditures on services, hence not creating a negative multiplier in their economies as much as the no-tax states are, and they're probably investing more in things like education and infrastructure. But it's complex. What's not complex is there's no correlation between your tax policy and your economy. What you need to do with tax policy is simply get it right so you can invest in core services. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you, Brian, and thank you, Ralph. Let me just take one question. There are so many that came in, but I think we'll look at those in the context of the later panel. I want to, so one question seemed to resonate, or one question seemed to be a little more common. This issue about the total tax burden in the state, notwithstanding the need to reform income tax, possibly sales tax, shouldn't we be focusing more on the total tax burden? Because that's what we hear in the media, this issue of total tax burden, and how can we respond to that?
All right, so total tax burden, there's a couple of different ways to measure that.
You push the button. Your button. You push the button.
Normally, I don't need amplification. The most meaningful way to measure tax burden state to state, because different states have very different tax mixes and fee mixes, is to look at all taxes and all fees charged at the state and local level in a particular state, take that amount as a percentage of personal income in the state. And then you know how much income is being taken in taxation and fees, right? So it doesn't matter if it's property tax or sales tax or whatever, at the end of the day, you know it all. Over the last 15 years, Illinois has consistently ranked in the bottom 10 in the nation in total state and local tax burden as a percentage of income. The only time we jumped out of there was during our temporary tax increase period, when we moved up to about 27th, 28th in the nation. We have the 5th largest population and the 5th largest economy. At no time can you call that tax burden high tax. And in fact, when you just compare us to our Midwestern neighbors, during that period of time, we ranked in the bottom 10 in the country overall. We were the 2nd lowest taxing state in the Midwest to Missouri. After our temporary tax increase, we jumped all the way up to 2nd lowest in the Midwest after only Missouri. We didn't even go up against our other states from a tax burden standpoint. That miracle state of Indiana, another miracle state we hear about, is a higher tax state than Illinois. If we had Indiana's tax mix, we'd have around $5 billion more in our general fund than we do today. So what really matters here isn't just overall burden. It's interesting from a comparison standpoint, but I think Brian was right to say it's distribution of that burden. And in Illinois, although we're low tax overall, we're very high tax for low and middle income families. So we really need to get some fairness into our tax system. So you don't have a lot of tools in the kit. The last thing you want is people getting creative with your fiscal system. That led to borrowing into pensions for decades. So what you want are honest solutions predicated on tax policy. So let's get the revenue in by adjusting the taxes the right way, and then create some fairness, even with our current limitations constitutionally, through refundable tax credits and those kinds of things.
I agree.
All right, well, great. Well, we will have some time to explore that and many other questions regarding the revenue side in a little while. But let's take a deep breath. Thank Brian and Ralph.